All right, well, thank you so much for having me. This is a really exciting gathering of people. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my research that I've been doing in the service of a book called Seeing Like a Supply Chain, which is on the history and infrastructure of the modern discipline of supply chain management. Um, the material I'm presenting here is actually presented at greater length in an article that just came out in Postmodern Culture. So if you can't get enough of this talk, there's a lot more detail and references um, in that article. But today I wanted to talk about some of the research that I recently completed on software and visibility in global supply chains. And the main thrust of my argument is that despite what you may hear from tech companies about visibility and transparency, supply chains are only able to work as efficiently as they do because of gaps in our knowledge about them. Um, when I first started researching supply chains, I was really struck by all of the talk about visibility and transparency across the supply chain. And so it took me a while to figure out that the reason people keep talking about this and promising visibility is because it doesn't actually exist to any meaningful extent. And to understand that, it might be helpful to look at a supply chain map. This is for a car company. You can see that the supply chain consists of many tiers, as many complex supply chains do. And individual suppliers will be themselves served by a number of individual sub-suppliers. So that the result is that the focal company there at the top generally has no idea what's going on in the lower tiers. So you can imagine that smaller subcontractors can be subbed in and out without anyone really knowing the difference. And that actually works quite well under, for a very specific definition of well and under normal circumstances. It allows supply chains to, in some sense, self-heal. If there is a labor strike, for example, or a natural disaster, the supply chain can route around the problematic area, find a new supplier, and keep going as though nothing has happened. As we've seen in the last couple months, this model has its limitations, but part of what I argue in the book is that this commitment to gaps in our visibility of the supply chain is part of what keeps supply chains moving as efficiently as we demand them. But of course, this also has some benefits for the companies at the top of the supply chain as well. You'll see it every time you encounter an article about labor abuses discovered in a supply chain. There's a refusal to take responsibility for any kinds of abuses uncovered in the supply chain. So in this case, Lululemon was informed about abuses in its supply chain and was able to say, and I think this is probably honestly that they didn't know about it. You'll find it in any article really about human labor abuse within supply chains. So even though companies claim to want more visibility into their supply chains, this lack of transparency allows companies to at least rhetorically disclaim any responsibility for labor abuses or sustainability. And once you start looking for it, you'll find it in every article. I would also argue that there's more than a little Orientalism kind of built into this argument, that no one can possibly know what's going on in the global South once subcontractors have started contributing to the supply chain. So in another part of this project, I looked at how software infrastructure works for companies that do manage their own factories. You may know that the industry standard for this kind of monitoring is SAP, which is a huge software suite. And the module responsible for supply chains is called SAP SCM. And in short, what I discovered through my investigation of this software is that it's entirely possible for a company to control the assembly of goods down to the minute and yet not know how the various parts of its manufacturing process connect together. It was quite hard to get access to SAP SCM because it's not something you can download from the App Store or check out at the library. So my methods relied on lots of instructional materials, and also I took the same training that SAP SCM specialists take, so 40 hours of one-on-one training with the SAP SCM module. So SAP SCM consists of large suites of tools called components, which are further subdivided into modules and then into individual functions, which SAP calls transactions. And because of the complexity of this enormous system, SAP specialists will usually wield expertise in only one of these components. For example, predictive marketing or like truck dispatching. So an SCM specialist, for example, will usually pass the baton to a database specialist if there's a need to modify the system's master data. Before she begins planning a supply chain manager will generally receive a forecast, like a package of data called a forecast, from a demand planner who specializes in analyzing trends in order to predict future demand. And then the supply chain manager works backwards from those predictions, lining up factories and ordering raw materials in order to make sure that the right quantities of goods are available at the right time. It was interesting to me that SAP's SCM module came with built-in optimizers, which is another word for artificial intelligence tools, which quickly sort through costs for storage, transport, and procurement in order to schedule the most cost-effective means of producing and delivering goods. SAP SCM can even work out the most cost-effective way to load goods into a container or a truck bed so that shipping containers are filled to the brim. But because SAP SCM is so modular, because each data package is handed off to a separate specialist who may know very little about the factors that produced it, the implications of one's decisions may only become clear when they're experienced by the workers on the factory floor. And of course, most supply chain managers wouldn't actually see that. As I continue my research into supply chains, I've become interested in a growing contingent of scholars who characterize these huge networks as what they call complex adaptive systems, or CAS networks. This latest thinking describes global supply networks as CAS, the same descriptor specialists use to describe the behavior of ecosystems and weather patterns. And the idea is that a network consists of innumerable agents, each of which acts according to local rules in order to optimize its own situation. The entire network is too large and multifaceted to predict its behavior with any accuracy, but to a CAS specialist, certain recognizable patterns may emerge. Let's see if this video works because it describes CAS pretty well.
The study of complex adaptive systems, or CAS, can help us understand the world and think in new ways to solve problems. For centuries, we looked at complex systems like these and wondered, how do they work? How do millions of birds collectively flying in one direction turn in an instant and all begin flying in another direction? Initially, we assumed that it must be the result of some amazingly efficient leadership structure, where an alpha bird of some kind gave crystal clear directives to the flock. We soon learned that there was no leader. There were only simple rules that each bird followed according to what its nearest local neighbors were doing. Remember, there is no leader. No bird has overall command and control. There's no global scale awareness of the whole system. It is just a whole mess of birds and a few simple rules that they follow.
So this, in short, is the idea that global supply chains constitute a complex adaptive system. I mean, what's striking about it immediately is that the supply network has been completely recast from a set of supply lines that a company controls to something like the weather or an ecosystem. You know, it's going to do whatever the hell it's going to do, and all the company can do is respond. So the company is not making the supply chain, the company is responding to what happens with no leader and no plan. You know, I'd love to talk at greater length about this, but it seems to me that we're moving further and further into a kind of algorithmic no man's land where no one is in control of the infrastructure that ties the world together. So I hope that was about on time.